Good morning, good afternoon for those of you watching from all over the world. My name is Albert and welcome to our next installment of Axiom in April, coming to you directly again from my home in Johannesburg, as this is our fifth week in lockdown here. A cloudy, cold Johannesburg at this moment, going into autumn. But yeah, welcome to all of you. It's been an awesome month of April, our fourth Axiom for this month, and just been enjoying it, getting a lot of good feedback from the market and from across the world. And yeah, we thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to look at delivery versus payment, or DvP, using distributed ledger technology. DvP, a term that if you come from banking or capital markets background, a term that you're all too familiar with in settlements. And yeah, Eric van der Linde, who's one of our senior architects at Andile, is just going to take us through how to use distributed ledger to do DvP. So as always, we're going to have a session about 45 minutes where he's going to take us and talk through it. At any time during the session, you can submit questions. So in the middle, there's a Q&A. At the center of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can use that button to submit questions at any time during the session. And right at the end, Eric will then take you through the answers or try and answer your questions as well as possible. But yeah, at this moment, that's all from me. I'm going to now hand over or welcome Eric to the session. Eric, how are you doing?
Thank you, Albert. Good, thanks yourself.
Good, good. As always, I'm just going to give a warning here. So I'm dialing in from my home. Eric's from his home. If you see children running into a session, I think at least at your side, there won't be any children coming in. If there is children, there's something wrong. But yeah, if we see your girlfriend or someone walking past or internet connection drop, we're all in the same situation. We're dialing in from home across all the world. So just a warning there. But Eric, maybe just give us a brief introduction and a history of who is Eric and what your experience.
Cool, thanks, Albert. So yeah, who am I? I started my career a few years ago as an embedded software engineer after I studied computer and electronic engineering. I joined Andile around about 5 years ago now, and I started working on our in-house fintech solution. So I've been involved in that since the beginning. So we started investigating the use of blockchain tech quite a few years ago now, and I've been involved in all the products that we've built on blockchain and the proof of concepts that we've had so far. So currently, I am one of the lead software engineers on one of our new products, which we call Mesh. Very exciting product. Hopefully, we can share a lot more of that in the near future. Yeah, and that's me. Should we get into what we will be doing today?
Before we get into it, so we're going to use polls during the session. I'm just launching a poll now where we're going to ask you questions and feedback. So the question we're just asking you just gives Eric a bit of insight into his audience, as he can't see all of you. What is your view on blockchain? It is the future. I don't trust it. I think it's a novelty. I don't know enough about it. The question we left out because it's been used too much is, well, blockchain is the answer. What was your question again? We've decided to leave that in. And Eric, I think you're a bit modest, but wasn't it true that in your previous job, you used to do development for military helicopter software?
To some extent, yes, that's true. Should I disclose that?
Okay. Let's stick to that and say that's what you did. That sounds very cool. So Eric, I'm now going to dial off and yeah, then you can get into it. Thanks.
Thanks, Albert. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. Let's look at the results from that poll quickly. Not yet. Okay, so what are we looking at today? So the first thing that we're going to look at is just a quick overview on what is delivery versus payment. So most of you should be familiar with it. We'll just have a quick introduction so that everyone's on the same page. We'll look at the purpose of delivery versus payment. Why is it useful and why do we use it? We'll look at a quick overview on what is a distributed ledger and what is DLT. We'll look at some concepts that we need to be familiar with to achieve delivery versus payment in a blockchain or DLT environment. Then we'll finally look at how to actually achieve delivery versus payment on a single ledger or in a single ledger environment. Then we'll look at delivery versus payment in a cross-ledger environment, so when the cash and the securities live on separate ledgers. And then lastly, we'll have a quick look at some of the risks that we still have with delivery versus payment in a DLT environment. Okay, so what is delivery versus payment? So formal definition here from the PFMI. It's a security settlement mechanism that links a securities transfer and a funds transfer in such a way as to ensure that the delivery occurs if and only if the corresponding payment occurs. So basically, if I am going to sell a security, I want to be very sure that I am going to receive cash in return for that. I do not want to hand over my security or my security token if I am not going to receive my cash. So this implies that these two transfers, the security transfer and the cash transfer, forms part of an atomic transaction. So if the one side fails, the other side must fail. So either both happens or neither. So what is the purpose of DvP? We've alluded to this a little bit just now, but the process is meant to reduce the risk that securities could be delivered without payment or that payments could be made without the delivery of securities. So basically it avoids settlement or principal risk, and that is the securities could be delivered without receiving payment. So we'll now look at a quick overview of what is distributed ledger technologies. So a distributed ledger is, in very basic terms, it's just a data storage mechanism. So most software systems today that everyone is familiar with probably use a centralized data store. So this is the databases that everyone is used to. And that just means it's administered from a central authority. So in a distributed ledger or a shared ledger, we have multiple different computers or nodes, as we can see here, and they could span across multiple geographic regions, and they all share a single state or a single ledger. So they all try to get to the same value. So two important things here for a distributed ledger that you should notice is that they all need to communicate with each other. So that's the first thing. They all need some communication mechanism. All these nodes need to be able to talk to each other, and they all need to have a consensus mechanism which they will use to decide on what is the truth, what is the agreed upon state of this ledger. So next we will look at a few examples of DLTs, and just quickly, what is the difference between blockchains and DLTs? So most distributed ledger technologies are blockchain based, but not all of them are. So as you can see on the image there on the right, that all blockchains are distributed ledgers, but not all distributed ledgers has to be a blockchain. So probably the most well-known example of a blockchain is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin uses a proof of work consensus mechanism. We won't dive into any of that technical stuff today. And just another example, IOTA's Tangle network, that is a distributed ledger, but it's not actually a blockchain. So IOTA uses something that they call a DAG, or a directed acyclic graph, for its consensus mechanism. And these are two popular examples of DLTs, just to show you that there is a difference between DLT and blockchain. So next, we're going to look at some concepts that we need to be familiar with when we want to understand how DvP works in this distributed ledger environment. So the first thing that we're going to look at, there we have someone at our gate in lockdown. So the first concept that we are going to look at is, what is a hash function? So we're running a poll here just to see how many of you are familiar with these terms and how comfortable you are with them. The second thing we're going to look at is public key cryptography. We won't get into any technical details. It's just a quick overview of what is and how we're going to use it. Thirdly, we're going to look at how digital signatures work, just very high level overview again, just so that everyone understands how this is applied to achieve DvP. The fourth concept is going to be multi-signatures. And lastly, we'll look at hash time lock contracts. So this is the crux or the mechanism that we will use to achieve cross-chain atomic swaps. Okay, so I see that most of you guys have heard of these terms. A few of you haven't heard of them, not sure what they are, and at least a few of you guys have used most of them at least once. That's very cool. So let's get started with the first concept. So what is a hash function? So if we look at the semi-formal definition provided to us from Wikipedia, it says that it is a mathematical algorithm that maps data of arbitrary size, which is often called the message or the input, to a bit string of a fixed size, which we call the hash typically. And it is a one-way function. So that is, it is a function which is practically infeasible to invert. So given an input, if you pass it through this cryptographic hash function, you will get an output that looks something similar to what we see there. So we have this grumpy cat, and if we represent this image as data and we pass it through this cryptographic hash function, in this scenario, we get a 32-byte hash output. So if we use something like SHA-256, which is probably the most commonly used cryptographic hash function, we will get 32 bytes output. So a few important concepts to take note of here. So firstly, if I put the same data in, I will always get the same data out. If I modify my input in any way, so if there's a slight variation in the input, the output will always be vastly different. So it is a very good mechanism to validate that data hasn't been tampered with. So another point to take note of is that a good cryptographic hash function won't have any collisions. So there's no two inputs that could yield the same output. So there will never be two different transactions or documents or images that will yield the same output if you pass them through the same cryptographic hash function. And the last thing to keep in mind here is that it is one way. So if you have the output, it is practically infeasible for you to ever receive or determine what was the input that generated this output. So let's keep that in mind. That's a very useful concept that we will use a bit later. Okay, so the second concept that we're going to look at, again, very high level, is public key cryptography. So what is this? Public key cryptography or asymmetric cryptography is a cryptographic system that uses pairs of keys. So there's a public key and there is a private key, and they are asymmetric, so they're not exactly the same. And you are allowed, or you are able to disseminate your public key to everyone. So you can hand out your public key to everyone, and your private key, you have to always keep safe. So your private key is always the counterpart to a specific public key. So if we look at a common use case that everyone is familiar with, is on the left here. So we are introduced to Alice and Bob, and Bob would like to send a message to Alice, but he doesn't want anyone else to read this message. So he will use Alice's public key to encrypt this message. So the first thing he does is he asks Alice for her public key. She happily gives it to him, and he uses this message to encrypt the Hello Alice document or message. And this could be a transaction or any information that you're sharing, and send it to Alice. Now, as you can see, once you've encrypted this, this yields some funky value that is unreadable to anyone without Alice's private key. So once Alice receives this message, she uses a private key and she can read the message again. Hello, Alice. So this is a typical use case of how HTTPS or TLS makes use of cryptography to secure information. So on the other spectrum, we have digital signatures. So on the right, you'll see that Alice now wants to send Bob a message, but she wants to sign this document. She wants to do two things. She wants to prove that this message really came from her, and she wants to add a signature to this document in such a way that no one can tamper with this document. So Alice uses a private key to sign a message that she would like to send to Bob. Hello, Bob. Once she signs this message, there's an output. So take note that you can still read this message. So hello, Bob is still visible to everyone who sees this message, but there's now a digital signature attached to this message. So Bob will now ask Alice for her public key. He can use this to verify that indeed this message came from Alice and that the message content wasn't tampered with. So that signature that Alice applied to the original message will only be valid for the original message. And we'll see how that works in just a little bit. So overview, in most cases, we use our public keys to encrypt data when we send it, and in digital signatures, very applicable to blockchain and DLT, we use our private keys to sign transactions or documents. Okay, so let's talk about this digital signatures concept. So how does it work? Alice has a document or a transaction or a settlement instruction that she wishes to sign. So she will write the information of this transaction onto a document and passes it through a hash algorithm. This hash algorithm gives us an output of fixed length, as we've seen earlier, and she can now use this hash value and apply her signature to the hash value. She doesn't actually need to sign the original document. She can simply sign the hash value, since there is no other document that could produce the same hash value. So once Alice receives this hash value from the hash algorithm, she uses a private key and uses a digital signature algorithm. So it functions similar to a hash algorithm, except it produces a digital signature. She then takes this digital signature, which consists of the hash value, and added or applied to the signed document. So now in order for her to send this document for validation, what happens? So Bob, on the other hand, or it could be the blockchain, receives this signed document or the signed transaction, and it splits the document contents from the signature. So it uses the same digital signature algorithm with Alice's public key, which will then produce the original hash value. So now Bob has confirmed that this digital signature truly does belong to Alice. Now he wants to make sure that the document wasn't tampered with in any way. So he'll take the document that was attached, run it through the same hash algorithm, and he will receive a hash value. If these two hash values are equal, he can with confidence say that this document was approved and signed by Alice. Okay, so this is typically how the blockchain operates. So the next concept, just very quickly, is multi-signatures. So multi-signature is a digital signature scheme which allows us to apply multiple signatures to a single document. So basically, we can require two signatures on a single document to make sure that both parties approve of this transaction or this document. So in a blockchain, when blockchain supports multi-signature addresses or accounts, then it enables us to require more than one signature to approve the transaction. So the final concept, just very quickly, is hash time lock contracts. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into how this really works. But the first thing that we need to understand is this hash lock mechanism. So what this hash lock gives us is it requires a secret value X to authorize a transaction. So I want to generate some secret X, a PIN code or anything, and I want to apply this to a transaction. So only if someone knows this secret value X will they be allowed to approve this transaction. So the typical case is we generate an X and then we generate the hash of X, which is Y in this example. So Y equals the hash of X to lock a transaction, and it can only be unlocked by providing X again. So this allows us to lock something with a PIN code, apply that to the transaction without ever exposing X. The second concept is the time lock. So a transaction that is valid only after a specified point in time. So I would like to approve this transaction, but it is only valid 2 hours or 4 hours from now. We will use both these concepts to achieve cross-chain atomic swaps, and we'll look how. Okay, so now we get to single ledger DvP. So we have Alice and we have Bob, and Alice would like to transfer securities to Bob in exchange for some cash. So as you can see here, there's 2 instructions that form part of the same transaction. So both these security instruction and the payment instruction live on the same blockchain. So this is the securities and the cash DLT. So what would happen is Alice creates the left-hand side of this transaction, Bob creates the right-hand side of the transaction, and together it forms a full set of instructions which becomes an atomic transaction. So either both of these instructions will happen or neither of them will. So if we look at the steps of how to actually achieve single ledger DvP, we can see here that we have 4 steps in this process, and then we have 3 parties that will partake in this process. So first we have our DLT right at the top in the first row. So this is the securities and the cash DLT, since both the securities and the cash live on the same ledger. So the first step, Alice would create the securities instruction. So she creates this document that states she is the sender, Bob should be the receiver of 7 securities. She doesn't apply a signature yet since she wants Bob to validate this. Bob on his end creates the cash instruction. So remember, this is the other side of that transaction. So he states that he will be the sender, Alice will be the receiver, and he will be sending 100 cash. So these are representations of tokens. Once he receives this instruction from Alice, he verifies that this is what they agreed upon. This is the correct exchange rate. And he attaches Alice's instruction to his to form a full set of instructions or a single transaction. Bob is now happy with the contents of this transaction and he applies his signature. Once he's applied his signature, he passes this whole document back to Alice for her to sign. Alice then verifies that Bob did not manipulate anything that she included in her securities instruction and that she is happy with the cash instruction that she received from Bob. So Alice will then go ahead and sign her side of the transaction. So this is a multi-signature transaction, and she can then submit this transaction to the DLT. And I've lost my screen sharing. Let's see if I can get that back.
So this is where I always need to come in and I need to make a joke or say something to buy you time, which I just did. Back to you, Eric.
Is it back? Amazing.
It is back, okay. Yes.
So we have seen how this process works. This transaction has been submitted to this ledger, and now the ledger can come to a consensus and securities will be delivered and the payment completed. So we have achieved delivery versus payment in an atomic transaction using a single ledger. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is cross-ledger delivery versus payment. So in this scenario, we have our securities on one ledger on the left, and we have our cash on a different ledger on the right. So again, Alice wants to transfer some securities to Bob, and Bob wants to pay some cash to Alice. This time though, both these securities can't be interlinked into a single transaction. So there will be 4 transactions involved, as you'll see now. And we link these 2 transactions, or 4 transactions rather, using HTLC. So this will allow us to achieve atomic swaps. So either both of these transactions will be finalized or they will receive back their funds. So let's look at how cross-ledger DvP actually works. Okay, so the first step that we have is Alice now generates a secret X. So she's going to make use of a hash lock. And she creates the first securities instruction that will be used in this process. So she states that she will be the sender, Bob will be the receiver, but if and only if Bob can provide an X which satisfies Y equals the hash of X. So she ensures that Bob has to provide X in order for him to receive these securities. But then there's a second part to this transaction. So if after 2 hours, Bob has not claimed these 7 securities, Alice will receive a refund. So Alice will receive all 7 of the securities back. She then signs this document and she submits it to the securities ledger, as you can see there in the first row. So the securities DLT is happy. They can validate that this is indeed signed by Alice, and they confirm and apply it to the ledger state. Bob can then see this because Bob has access to both these ledgers. He then creates the first cash instruction. So Bob states that he will be the sender, and he replicates what Alice did. So he states that Alice can receive 100 cash if and only if Alice can provide that same X that satisfies Y equals the hash of X, and it must be provided by Alice. So no one else is allowed to expose this X except for Alice. If Alice, however, does not provide this X within 1 hour, Bob will receive a refund. So notice here that there is a time lock discrepancy. So Alice will receive a refund 2 hours later, and Bob will receive his refund within 1 hour. So the reason for this is Alice has an advantage. She knows what X is. So if Alice were to act malicious in any way, and these 2 time locks were of the same value, Alice could wait just before the refund time happens, and then she can claim this cash instruction by providing X. And seconds later, she could then refund herself with the initial securities transfer. And then she will end up sitting with both the cash and the securities. So this time discrepancy allows Bob and Alice to have the same amount of time to expose X. So assuming Bob has finished filling in this first cash instruction, he will then submit it to the cash distributed ledger. So because this only requires Bob's signature, the cash DLT can verify and confirm that this is a valid transaction and signs it into the shared ledger or the shared state. So once Alice sees that Bob has created this transaction, she now knows that she can receive 100 in cash because she knows X. So she does exactly that. She creates the second cash instruction. So this is a transaction that will be submitted. And she says that I, Alice, will be the receiver of 100 cash. I am going to expose X to the whole world. So the whole world will now be able to see X once I submit this. And I'm going to sign this to prove that it is really me who is providing this X. So once Alice signs this and submits it to the cash ledger, the cash ledger will verify and confirm this transaction. And it sees that it satisfies the conditions that Bob provided. So that will allow Alice to receive a cash, and the payment side of this transaction is completed. Alice has received her cash. So once she submitted that value to the cash ledger, Bob is able to see the secret X, just like the rest of the world. So Bob gets the secret X from the cash ledger, and he creates the second securities instruction. So Bob states that he will be the receiver of 7 securities, not cash. And he uses the secret that Alice has just exposed. So he signs this since he must be the one to provide the secret as stated by Alice in her initial securities transaction. So once he submits the second security instruction to the securities ledger right at the top, the security ledger can now verify that this is indeed a valid transaction, and the securities ledger state will then be updated. So that will then conclude securities being delivered. And by following all of this in a happy day scenario, we have achieved a cross-chain atomic swap. So there was no risk involved for either of them exposing their funds. So let's quickly look at a fail scenario that could happen. So if Alice submitted the first securities instruction to the network, and Bob sees this transaction and creates the first cash instruction. Once he submitted this cash instruction, he needs to keep monitoring and have access to this cash DLT to see when Alice will expose the secret X. If Bob, for any reason, loses access to the network, he lives in a rural area and he loses all internet communications after he submitted the initial first cash instruction. Alice could still claim the second cash instruction and receive the cash. But now Bob will not be able to submit the second securities transaction before Alice is allowed to refund herself the initial 7 securities. So this is one security risk that could happen. It is very unlikely, and there are some mechanisms around it. So that is basically covering all cross-ledger DvP scenarios using hash time lock contracts. So lastly, we can look at the risk that we've just seen. So there are still some risks when we use DLTs for DvP. And the first one is liquidity risk. So if in the previous scenario that we just saw, Bob fails to comply or acts maliciously in any way, Alice has locked her funds for 2 hours. So she cannot access those securities for the next 2 hours. So these time values could be hours, it could be minutes, or it could be days. So that introduces some liquidity risks, as she will not have access to that funds until the refund or the time lock expires. So then there is still principal risk, like we saw, if Bob loses complete access to that second cash settlement DLT. So principal risk, if the time lock expires and Alice can then refund herself after receiving the cash. And that is everything for today. Thank you very much. Back to you, Albert.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for the effort put into, and also thanks to Alice and Bob just helping us to explain it. I think it was broken down well by yourself. Just going to take over from you to screen sharing. We've got a couple of questions that came through, and you can still submit some questions now as we start answering your questions. But I think, yeah, the first question was just was a short question, but maybe you could just take a step back. Was what exactly are these keys? So you were talking, when you took us through it, you were talking about keys, and maybe, Eric, if you can maybe just elaborate on what those keys are that you spoke about.
Okay, so the private and the public counter key parts ultimately is just a secret string value. So once you generate a cryptographic secure string, it's basically a very long password that has a counterpart public key. So given a private key, you will always be able to generate the public key from that. So once you expose your private key, anyone can access anything that you have secured with that.
Okay, all right. I think next question that came in, and it's got, you always have this question coming through, going back to Bitcoin. One is, and this you can give your personal answer. You can choose not to answer it as well if you don't want to. But do you think Bitcoin will stand the test of time?
Yes, I think so. I think it won't be in the shape and form that we know it today. Bitcoin will keep evolving. It is a revolutionary new technology, and we're going to keep using it. I don't think Bitcoin is going to go away. I think it will need to keep evolving and adapting to research and new development that happens in this space.
I'm going to jump around just while we're on that topic. There's a question that came through. It says, what is the difference between Ethereum and Bitcoin blockchain? If we can maybe throw that one out to you quick.
So I think the basic difference is that Ethereum was intended to be, so Ethereum incorporates smart contracts. So Ethereum runs in a virtual machine environment. So you can program against, very flexible program against the Ethereum blockchain. Ethereum is also switching to a different consensus mechanism. So there's quite a few differences. Right now, Ethereum is in theory a lot more powerful in its use cases compared to Bitcoin.
Okay. And I think next question that I'm going to ask you as one that came through from Peter Bauer. And it's, how widely is atomic swaps supported by some of the most popular DLTs?
That's a good question. So natively, almost none of the popular blockchains support cross-chain atomic swaps. So using HTLC or hash lock time lock contracts like we saw in this example, almost all the popular ones do support this slightly differently. So each blockchain has some slight underlying differentiation in the implementation. But as long as the blockchain supports hash locks and time locks and multi-signature addresses, you could achieve cross-chain atomic swaps like we saw in this example. If, however, there's a native protocol that all the blockchains adhere to, you could achieve cross-chain atomic swaps without introducing the settlement risks that we saw in this example.
Okay, all right, cool. Next question we have here, and so it's the second one is, does this DvP assume pre-funding? And then the second question on the back of that is, can we lock funds prior to settlement runs?
Yeah, it does assume pre-funding. What was the second part of the question?
Can we lock funds prior to the settlement run?
Can we lock funds prior to the settlement? Yes, there is various different techniques to lock it depending on how long in advance you want to lock it. Ideally, you do not want to lock funds. You just want to achieve the guarantee that the transactions will both settle. So in the scenario, it's using a pre-funding model where the securities are locked and the cash is locked. And then once these transactions settle, they both get delivered. So this whole process in real life, depending on the underlying blockchain, will depend on how long the validation takes, but it could happen in a matter of minutes. So the whole process could lock funds, settle both transactions in a matter of seconds, actually.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to give, there's a couple of questions that came through, and thanks everyone, but I'm just going to, last two I'm just going to go through is, and there's a lot coming through. It just shows you it's something between that people are interested in. And I think what I'm going to ask you is, this is an easy one for you. What are the drawbacks of blockchain?
Not an easy one. There is lots of drawbacks. I think blockchain, so it's not well understood at the moment. So people are not adopting it. So one of the drawbacks is it's not widely accepted. So the practical use case for blockchain is limited by the fact that it's not widely adopted. So all these crypto assets are valuable in a very technological way, but it's not useful yet since very few people actually adopt the technology. I think another drawback of blockchain is it makes it very hard for regulators to decide on what they really want to see. So it's changing the way that they have to look at payments and instructions and how all of this works. And then another thing, depending on the consensus mechanism, so the Bitcoin blockchain uses a proof of work, which is very inefficient. So it's not a very green way. It burns a lot of electricity, and it's a lot of solving hard problems for no good use. So there are quite a few drawbacks still, but ultimately it's a revolutionary technology.
Okay. Okay, then I'm going to, last one, I'm going to go for a difficult one. Well, difficult for me in that case, so maybe it's not for you. It's one that came through from James Francis. It says, many BC ledgers are being developed by peers in verticals. Is this the most likely use case for distributed ledgers as opposed to ledgers as a competitive advantage?
I'm not sure I understand the question. BC ledgers in a?
Being delivered by peers are in vertical. So I think the question is more mostly in vertical. So if I focus on that part of it, is that the most likely use case for distributed ledgers? Maybe I am just throwing this question to you in the wrong way here.
I'm not sure. I think if you can send us an email, we can definitely dive into the answer there.
Francis, we're going to go offline with that one. I will answer that question to you offline. And then then I'm going to leave you with this one. What is the difference between accounts and wallets?
That is a good question as well. So a wallet is where you keep your keys. So the private keys that we've discussed, a wallet is intended to be a safe way where you place those keys. And an account is typically the public key counterpart that lives in the open. So everyone can see all accounts, and the public keys are always somehow related, mostly directly related to the accounts, and the private keys live in the wallet. So you keep your wallet safe to access your account.
Okay. Eric, I'm going to thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your preparation. There's a lot of time away today. Really appreciate it. Closing thoughts. Maybe if you leave us with one closing thought, what would that be from your side?
Yeah, I think people should get involved in the crypto space. They should understand it. They should be comfortable with it. I think the more people that become comfortable with how it works, especially in the development industry, the more it will be adopted. It truly is a game-changing technology. it changes the way that we think about what we can achieve. Yeah, I think it's going to change the world drastically, and it already has. So it'll keep doing that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it. So, yeah, thank you, everyone. That brings it to a close for our last session for April. If you have any questions that you want to discuss, anything more, want to access to the recording or to the slides or anything, just send us an email on axiom@andilesolutions.com and we'll get back to you. We will be sharing the recordings. So within the next couple of days, we will be sharing those with you. What's next? Well, watch this space. We've got some exciting lineups for May. We are going to change it a bit up in terms of a forum discussion, which we will share with you in the next couple of days. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for dialing in today. Stay safe wherever you are and have a good rest of your week. If you're in South Africa, have a good short week. Speak to you all soon. Cheers.